need to start my video as well. All right, good. Well, it's good morning from where I'm based here in Austria. Good afternoon to everyone. Can you all see and hear me all right? And can you see my screen? Jonathan, could you just quickly confirm?
Yes, I can see screen and you're coming through loud and clear.
All right, fine. Thanks very much. All right, so I was supposed to be joined by Dan at this time, but since he's based in Hawaii and there's sort of time zone mix-ups, I'll get the ball rolling and then we'll see if he joins us at a later point or not. Our talk is on the current situation that many test users and test providers are facing, and that is the COVID pandemic. So we're trying to look at options, challenges, and opportunities of at-home administration, a very topical issue as we find. And we'll be looking at three particular issues to do with at-home administration, that is technology, validity, and security. Now, the technology behind all of this at-home administration is quite remarkable in that just a couple of years or decades ago, this would not have been sort of imaginable that we would have millions of test takers taking high-stakes language tests from home. And the technology is sort of the backbone of this, is what's making it all possible. Now, on the plus side for test users, the requirements on the part of the test taker in terms of hardware and software are fairly moderate. So one thing that we found in looking at several tests and test options is that the hardware requirements were fairly modest, but cameras are in fact key. So you need to have a camera. It will come into play at some stage of the test. And you also need some form of audio playback. Now, an interesting observation that we've made is that there seems to be quite a difference between how test providers handle this issue of using headphones or using speakers. Some explicitly require headphones because they are worried about exam content sort of leaking, in that other people in the room might be listening in, or there might be some recording device, while other test providers strictly prohibit the use of headphones because they are more worried about in-exam assistance happening and some sort of device being hidden under the headphones. So that's an interesting issue that test providers seem to be handling differently. A lot of tests are available for both operating systems, Windows and Mac, and there are differences in terms of some test providers using their own browsers or secure exam browsers, so-called lockdown browsers, while others can be taken through regular browsers like Chrome or Safari and what have you. Also on the plus side, the bandwidth requirements in terms of internet connectivity are fairly moderate as well. When it comes to validity, the at-home switch for many test providers required a quick and, for some providers, a fairly considerable pivot. Some test providers like Duolingo, they have been offering at-home solutions for a while, or even were conceptualized as at-home solutions. But the question then is, how robust or extensive was the validation evidence for that particular test for we called it the pre-COVID version of a test for a particular purpose or use? And if there was any extensive validation evidence and robust validation evidence for this previous version, how much did that version change now? And how much of that validation evidence that we had on this older version would now be transferable and still applicable to the at-home online proctored or remotely proctored version of the test? And the interesting question there is one of equivalence, because we think it's very important that we consider not just equivalence of scores, and that is being investigated, but that there's also other components to this discussion. So an equivalence of scores is just one part of it. We also need to look at equivalence of tasks or equivalence of constructs, and are the interpretations based on these two different test versions, are they also equivalent? Okay, so it's not enough in our view to say, okay, they scored X on the paper-based version of the test, and they scored the same in the online or the at-home version of the test. We also need to look sort of behind the curtain and see, okay, are the constructs behind this actually comparable? And it's also an interesting question if test users, or for instance, admissions officers, switch from one test to another. We all know these sort of equivalence table of what's an IELTS band on another test. But it's more than just what's a band in another test score. It's also, are the constructs behind these two tests, are they comparable? And this is particularly relevant because we know from research, fairly recent research as well, that just because the scores are equivalent doesn't mean that the actual processing of the test taker is the same as well. So research coming out of Lancaster University or out of Teachers College, Columbia, research coming out of Crella in Bedfordshire, they've all found that while on the surface the scores might be fairly stable between one mode and the other, the construct and the cognitive processing behind it does actually change quite a bit from paper-based to digital delivery. And that's not even factoring in the at-home administration. This is just comparing paper-based and digital delivery. So that's definitely something to keep in mind when looking at all of these new tests and test versions popping up. And related to this, to some extent, is the issue of security, because security questions are key for particularly test providers, and they are also key for score users because they do have implications for validity and fairness. They have implications because security issues might introduce construct irrelevant variance. If there is, for instance, in-exam assistance, then the scores that we get do not really reflect that individual's language ability. And it's also an issue of fairness, because if there is a security issue with either exam content being exported and being made available for study, or with in-exam assistance, it creates unequal opportunity. Some get that advantage and others do not. So in terms of security, there's really two groups we feel of threats. One is this issue of exporting test material that because people are using it sort of unsupervised in their bedroom, there's no invigilation in a test center, there's a higher risk, some people feel, of test material being exported. So keys, prompts, or topics being lifted. And the other group of security concerns relates to in-exam misconduct or cheating in the live exam, using unapproved aids or receiving real-time assistance. Now, one way of addressing this has been through remote proctoring, or typically we use invigilation or proctoring to make sure there are no, or at least only limited security issues. So usually there's some sort of screening before a test in a test center. You have ID verification, contraband inspection, and so on and so forth. You monitor during a test, you scan for misconduct, you ensure compliance to rules, and you have some sort of checkout phase after a test where materials are collected again and you prevent removal of test materials or notes. Now, all of this is happening regularly, or has been happening regularly in test centers, and it gets somewhat more complicated and challenging when all of this is happening in the bedrooms of candidates. That doesn't mean to say that it's not possible, and the way how some test providers have addressed this is through remote invigilation or remote proctoring. The question there is, how can you actually ensure that there are no unapproved aids in the testing environment? How can you ensure that there's no one providing real-time assistance? And how can you prevent screen captures, notes, recordings, etc. being exported in that test material is then leaked and there's a threat to item bank security? And then related to this issue of validity and fairness in particular, how can you actually ensure that the conditions are standardized and fair for all candidates so that they can demonstrate their language ability? And with remote proctoring, the question is, do you do that in-house or do you hire a third party? Now, when you do it in-house, for instance, as Duolingo has done from the start, you have the advantage of having complete control as a test provider of the proctoring process. You often have proprietary technology that's well integrated into the testing platform. The downside is it requires expertise and it requires a lot of resources in terms of the development. When you kind of outsource that to a third-party provider like Proctor.U or Examity as just two prominent examples, you have less control. The question is, do you also have less accountability? And you get a one-size-fits-all solution. The upside is, of course, that you can implement that relatively quickly. But for tests like Duolingo, who have been doing this from the get-go, basically, they didn't need to pivot and didn't need that extra time to implement it rapidly. In terms of remote proctoring, to address these security and validity concerns, there's two groups of technologies, you could say. One is more video-based and the other is more software-based. Now, if you go down the audio-video route, then this involves visually confirming the identity or showing some sort of ID document. The camera is important to inspect the test take environment, making sure that there's no other devices, no sticky notes, and so on. And there's only the allowed materials in front or around the candidates. And you can also watch and listen live for in-exam misconduct. You can also use audio playback for that. And you can sort of, in interacting with the candidate, you can confirm that there's no export of materials. Other test providers, or some test providers, have used the audio-based route only. Others have decided to go for a combination of the two. That is, also enlist the help of software-based approaches. So these are things like using locked-on browsers or secure exam browsers to prevent everything else on the computer from being opened. So any non-exam websites or programs are just basically shut down, which also implies a temporary loss of control and potentially privacy. And there's a whole range of issues surrounding that. Software can also help to monitor computer activity, so screen recording and what sort of things the candidate clicks on. And integrated with video, there's also on the rise the AI-based behavior monitoring. So if I was taking a test now and I'd be looking at another place that's sort of unexpected, and I'd be doing that for quite a while or repeatedly, then maybe the AI would flag that as a suspicious behavior, and a human would then go in and re-watch that and basically check whether there's nothing untoward happening during the exam. Now, for the purpose of this presentation, we thought we would illustrate some of these issues with just 4 of the options for English language testing that are available. These are sort of bigger players. It's the ACTFL Test of English Proficiency, the TOEFL IBT Special Home Edition, the DET, the Duolingo English Test, and the IELTS Indicator. That doesn't mean to say that there's not many more, and in fact you can find some more and also some more details behind this presentation in this recent test review that Dan and I have authored for the journal Language Testing, which is open access, so freely available, and please do check that out. So what we found in this review process was that for technology, there were some interesting things, as I already said. All of them require a camera, microphone, and some form of audio playback, but this issue with headset and speakers, as I've outlined, illustrates different priorities on the part of the test providers. So while those with speakers might not be so concerned with item bank security, maybe because they potentially have a large item bank, for instance, or they have lots of randomized versions of tests, like Duolingo, for instance. And other test providers might be more concerned with that and therefore prioritize the headset use because they don't want any exam content to be leaked. And Duolingo and ETS, for instance, they seem to be more concerned about this in-exam assistance issue. In terms of browser, ACTFL exams and Duolingo, they operate on Chrome or Opera, whereas IELTS Indicator and ETS TOEFL IBT, they use a sort of secure or specific test browsers, special exam browser. In terms of bandwidth, interesting observation that the requirements, as I said, were fairly moderate. And screen resolution was only specified in one particular case, and that's the ACTFL. Now, when it comes to validity, there's again some differences. We can see that ACTFL and TOEFL IBT, they have a fairly long history of computer-delivered tests. ACTFL even has a longer history of at-home administration. And so there's quite some research evidence, some validation evidence behind those two tests. The Duolingo English test is a fairly recent test by comparison. It has the advantage that it's been conceptualized as an at-home test from the start, but the validity evidence for it, due to its age, really is really only emerging. And the IELTS Indicator is an interesting case because IELTS has a very long tradition of extensive research reports, but the research has mainly focused on the paper-based version. And so the tasks on the IELTS Indicator are identical to the traditional IELTS, in that they have this academic English focus, but the research behind it for the validation still needs to catch up for this at-home version. Now, for security, again, some interesting differences. ACTFL always, or for a long time, allowed remote proctoring. They use or enlist the help of a third party, that's LogMeIn and Examity. There is confirmation of ID, as is in all of the exams, and ACTFL uses live video monitoring plus software monitoring. TOEFL also uses the help of a third party. They use ProctorU, and they also do video-based live monitoring and software monitoring. Duolingo is using, as one security measure, a large adaptive item bank. And they also use AI and human reviewing of the session recordings to, whenever the AI flags up some suspicious behavior, to go back and check. And an interesting case is, again, the IELTS, because here there was probably the most considerable pivot. And this also shows how dynamic this whole situation currently is, because IELTS really needs to be applauded for making this shift very quickly and also readjusting in the months following it, because initially the indicator only used confirmation of ID and had this live speaking exam proctoring and used a secure exam browser. And now, just in the couple of months after this whole movement started, they are also now switching, or have switched, to a combination of AI and human proctoring. So this, of course, still leaves us with some questions for test providers and score users. One is, which security threats are actually the most pressing? Is it more of a threat that there's in-exam assistance or cheating happening, or are we more worried about the export of test material? And this is kind of nicely illustrated by this headphones versus speakers debate. Another question that we feel our field needs to kind of address is, how intrusive do you need to be in terms of taking over control of this person's machine, but also in terms of the looking around people's rooms and everything. Related to that is the question of what risks this poses to examinee anxiety and also examinee well-being. It's something that we think at least should be investigated and monitored. And when it comes to live human proctoring or software-based proctoring, the question is also, is this necessary, or is it a matter of confidence? And then when it comes to, particularly for test providers, this question of, do I do it in-house or do I enlist a third-party proctor? There are issues around trust, responsibility around it, because also looking ahead, the question is whether remote proctoring will actually cease after COVID, or whether this is a phenomenon that's now been kind of kick-started, even though it's been around for a while, but it's sort of been given a new boost in this situation. And the question is whether this is maybe here to stay as well. And so what we wrote in our paper, or what we cited, is this quote by Gibson, who said, the future's already here, it's just not very evenly distributed. So I think what we need to look at, both in terms of challenges and opportunities, are things like access to tests. So remote proctoring has the potential of increasing access to tests, because people don't have to travel for hours to test centers anymore. But on the other hand, they now need this technology, and that might also, again, not be very evenly distributed. So there's lots of interesting opportunities, but also challenges around that. Also questions around flexibility. So remote at-home proctoring has sort of highlighted that it allows more flexibility on the part of the test taker. But is that really so? And is that a thing that's really, is that a really positive outcome? And then more generally, when we look at this sort of digital delivery and online delivery of exam, there's the question of, is this maybe also a chance to increase the authenticity? Because a lot of communication is happening online, and do we make full use yet in our tests of mirroring that in our exams? And are there maybe other interesting avenues of innovation that we could explore to kind of future-proof our language assessments? So it's with this that I'd like to close, and if there's any comments or questions on this, I'll be quite happy to take them. Thanks very much for joining me for this session. I'm looking forward to seeing what you have to say on this.
Thank you very much, Benjamin, for your wonderful presentation. And yes, we have a number of questions. Oh no, Daniel just came. Maybe Daniel can be the person who answers all the questions as punishment.
Oh yeah,
hi Daniel.
Let's do that.
Hi, I am so sorry. I had some technical issues.
No worries.
Yeah,
no problem.
But I'm sure Ben did. I caught the last bit. I'm sure he did a fantastic job throughout.
He did a sterling job here. So a number of questions. I'll begin with Tracy first for both of you. And Tracy's question was, has there been any instances of students being able to get around the proctoring systems that have been used by some of these high stakes tests?
Well, not that we know of. At least nothing's been reported as of yet. Presumably there have been attempts to get around these systems. There is some existing research kind of more generally about remote proctoring because it's been used for quite some time in higher education for classroom-based tests or course-based tests. But yeah, we haven't heard any news of any major security breaches since language testing has shifted to remote invigilation.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions. One question from Kyle. To what extent has validation research investigated the conduct of remote proctors and its impact on test takers?
So far, not much. There is some research, if we go back a ways, on the effects of in-person proctors. So, for example, interviewers in tests like the IELTS or the oral proficiency interview. But as far as I know, there hasn't been a whole lot of research on effects that, for example, the kind of security-oriented proctoring through the webcam might have on test takers. So that sounds like an important area to pursue going forward.
Yeah, absolutely, because it's likely that it will have an impact. And this also comes back again to this issue, do I do it in-house, where I have basically the control over the training and the behavior of my invigilators, or do I contract a third party where I possibly have less accountability? And that's sort of another aspect to this whole debate. Should this be done in-house, or is it okay with a third party? And how much control or quality assurance do I have from the third party? Because I absolutely agree with Kyle, it's likely to have an impact, and it's not very well researched yet, as Dan has said.
Thank you. We have another question from Lucy. Does live human proctoring change if the test taker is under 18? She feels there might be issues with human remote proctoring and teenagers taking tests at home.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. As far as I know, in most localities, it wouldn't change any sort of legal issues as I'm aware. There has been some discussion, though, that compared to adult test takers, minors are in less control of their home testing environment. They're sort of, in the situations that they find themselves in, and they might have more difficulty securing a quiet and suitable place to take an exam.
I'd like to ask one question, actually, before we finish. We're nearly at the end time. You've mostly discussed proctoring systems for high stakes tests, but I'm a little bit curious. What about more local assessment in the classroom? Have you got any advice for teachers who at the moment are conducting their own remote testing? How can they ensure security of their own tests?
Yeah, that's a very interesting issue, because in a way we talk about these large-scale tests, right? But actually a lot more testing that's happening every day throughout the world is the kind of classroom-based assessment. So in a way that's the even larger scale assessment, right? And that's why this is an issue that we're actually currently looking into. Often the problem is that there's not a lot of reporting of good practice in that area, because usually people are busier with other things and getting the job done. So it's something that we're still kind of digging into. There have been some like a presentation at an ILTA webinar, for instance, a couple of months ago by colleagues from Teachers College in New York, who have shifted their kind of tests to an online environment with the help of a third-party proctoring service. that's sort of maybe mid-stakes, you could argue. So they would probably be the better people to ask than we are at the moment. That's Jim Purpura and his students and colleagues. But I unfortunately don't have a particularly practical recommendation of a particular tool or anything. Unfortunately, this is something that's often kind of neglected, and that's exactly why we're trying to look into that aspect in more detail with actually just a project that's been sort of coming out of all of this very recently. I don't know whether, Dan, you want to add on something, whether you have any specifics.
Yeah, no, I think you've pretty well covered most of it. The only other thing that comes to mind is, you know, designing assessments to be a little bit, you know, if security is the concern, then designing assessments to be harder to subvert by those who would, you know, seek to sort of indulge in a little bit of unfair play. So, you know, there are recommendations to use more performance-based assessments, things that you can't just, you know, there's not a list of answer keys or things to just neatly follow. And then actually for a long time in many educational settings, you know, anti-plagiarism software, you know, Turnitin, things like that can be used to verify the originality of, for example, a written performance assessment without requiring sort of during test live and more invasive proctoring. It's just sort of a check that happens after the fact. So that might be another thing to consider.
Thank you. Thank you both once again, particularly Benjamin for your wonderful presentation, and thank you, Daniel, for making an appearance. Coming up next in this room will be Laura Davis and Joseph Davis on exploring the impact of introducing, Turnitin, already just mentioned, during COVID-19, undergraduate and postgraduate EAP accounts of second language writing assessment and feedback. We'll be beginning in around 7 minutes or so. So go and have a break, and I'll hope to see you in there soon. Bye-bye. Thanks again, guys.
So hopefully, or expectedly, you'll get your answers there, Jonathan, in the next presentation.
I'll ask that question again, yeah.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Thanks, Jonathan, for the support. Bye, everyone. Take care.
Bye. Bye-bye.